The church smelled faintly of lilies and candle wax, a scent that had always reminded me of Sundays with Linda by my side. Now it carried nothing but absence. I stood near the front pew, staring at the framed photograph of her, the one Emily had picked out, and for a moment I felt as if my chest had collapsed in on itself. People filed past me, offering condolences, hands on my shoulder, voices speaking words I barely heard. I nodded. I murmured thank you, but it was all a blur. My wife was gone. After 45 years of marriage, the silence of her absence was louder than the organ echoing through the church. When the service ended, I stayed behind, moving slowly as the crowd drifted toward the doors. My hands lingered on the wooden pew, smooth from decades of prayers and hands like mine gripping it in grief. The sound of my son's footsteps came sharp against the stone floor. Daniel, tall and well-dressed with that confident air he had carried since his 30s, walked up and grabbed my elbow. His grip was firm, not comforting, but urgent, as though the moment he had waited for had finally arrived. We stepped outside into the cold Ohio air. The church bell tolled, once heavy and slow. I wanted to breathe to steady myself, but before I could, Daniel turned to me. His eyes were sharp, his jaw tight. His voice came out low but cutting. "Dad, you have been a failure your whole life. You cannot even manage this house alone. It is too much for you. Sign the papers. Sell it. Let me handle it." For a moment I could not even process the words. The cold air stung my lungs, and his voice echoed in my head. Failure. The word struck deeper than the burial hymn that had just played for his mother. Failure. After years of building a life, raising children, paying every bill with sweat from my years at the steel plant, that was what my son saw when he looked at me. I looked at him, my own son, the boy I once carried on my shoulders through Little League fields, the man I had hugged when he got his first job in real estate, and I could not find my voice. I felt the weight of Linda's picture still in my hand, the one I had carried out of the church pressed against my chest like a shield. I tightened my grip on the frame until my knuckles burned. My heart pounded and my throat ached, but no words came out. Daniel's expression hardened, as if my silence confirmed his belief. He shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and stepped away toward his car where Susan was waiting. Her arms crossed, and her eyes unreadable. I stood there on the steps, my black coat heavy on my shoulders, the Ohio wind whipping across the empty parking lot. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the picture of Linda closer, the glass cold against my palm. I remembered her smile, her laugh, the way she always told me I was steadier than I ever gave myself credit for. Failure. That word kept circling in my mind like a cruel refrain. I could almost hear Linda's voice pushing back against it, reminding me of nights when I came home covered in steel dust, and she said she was proud that I stayed true. Yet here I was on the church steps, my son pinning me down in the shadow of his mother's fear. I wanted to shout at him, to tell him he was wrong, that I had given everything I had to this family. I wanted to remind him that the roof over his head when he was a boy came from my years at the plant, that the food on the table was bought with calloused hands and aching knees. But the words stuck in my throat. All I could do was hold Linda's picture tighter, as if she were still here anchoring me. My eyes blurred and I blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall where Daniel could see them. The parking lot grew quiet. The last few guests drove away, leaving me alone with the winter wind and the sound of the bell fading in the distance. I turned back toward the church, my legs heavy, and whispered a promise only I could hear. I will not crumble. Not now. Not because of him. Not even after losing you. I stood there until the cold forced me to move my breath rising in clouds. With every step toward my car, the word failure echoed, but beneath it, something else stirred, something quiet but unbroken, like a spark refusing to die. I pulled onto Maple Street and let the church fall away in the rearview mirror. The rhythm of the wipers set a steady beat, and with it came the old cadence of the plant. I was 23 when I walked through those gates the first time, a kid with a toolbox and a head full of diagrams. By my 30s, I knew the main mill as well as I knew the bones in my own hand. He died the year before I got hired. She would say it when I left before dawn, when I came home after midnight, when I missed a school recital, and tried to hide the grease on my sleeve. Linda and I had bought cough syrup there when the boys were little. Daniel arguing with Michael about who had better hands. Linda's hand on my shoulder telling me to sit and that she would get the gravy. Linda had painted the front door blue the year I retired. The plant threw a small party in the break room. The foreman told me the place ran smoother because I never panicked. More dinners with the boys. I hung my coat and set the framed photo of her on the entry table. You keep things steady, Robert. I wanted to believe that steadiness was still somewhere inside me, that Daniel's word could not strip it of its weight. He had not always been like today. I try to be fair. Daniel used to climb into my lap with toy cars and ask how engines breathed. He was quick, impatient, full of plans. Real estate suited him. Somewhere along the way, his impatience turned into a habit of pushing. I carried the mug to the table and sat in Linda's chair without thinking. That is how memory works, a body moving where it remembers comfort. On the far wall hung the family calendar from last year, the one I had not taken down. Small squares crowded with Linda's handwriting. Checkup. Call Emily. Pay gas. The first time we wrote the word infusion was the day the house learned a new kind of quiet. That was 2 years ago, a spring morning with a sky too cheerful to be honest. Daniel came with us to the oncologist the first time. He wore a blazer that day, a phone that vibrated on the table every 10 minutes. The doctor spoke and I watched his lips and heard nothing but blood in my ears. Linda reached under the table and squeezed my hand. Daniel asked about costs, timelines, best outcomes, worst outcomes. He looked at me and said that we needed a plan, and maybe the house was too much for us now. He said it softly then, as if he were trying to be kind, while nudging a heavy door. We tried to keep Sundays the same after that. Pot roast when she could handle the smell, soup when she could not. Daniel came sometimes. He would clear dishes and glance at his phone, eyes flicking with numbers. Michael came more often. He sat with his mother and asked about old classmates, about a television show she liked, about anything that was not a diagnosis. He helped me change a light fixture one afternoon, and when we were up on the ladder, he said that he thought Daniel felt pressure to solve everything by moving pieces. I said that his brother had a good heart. Michael nodded and said he hoped I was right. At the infusion center, Daniel stood by the window on calls, speaking in a flat, professional murmur about contingencies and days on market. Linda rested her head against my shoulder and whispered that I was still the anchor. She told me I held us in place when the tide got strange. I nodded and held her hand and watched Daniel outline a plan for a downsize that would reduce stress. His words were logical. They were also cold. That was the moment the weather changed between us. It did not thunder. It set like a frost before dawn and lingered. By late summer, Linda's scarf drawer smelled like lavender sachets she had tucked between the fabric. The house learned to walk quietly, to let her sleep. On her good days, she sat on the porch and counted finches. On her bad days, she slept, and I learned a new geography of the pharmacy aisle. Daniel visited, then left early, saying he had a showing in Boardman or a client in Poland. He would hug her and tell her she looked strong. He would squeeze my shoulder and tell me we would have to be realistic about the future. It came from his mouth like a sentence already written. I took a sip of tea and set the mug down. My hand brushed the drawer by my knee, and I opened it. Inside lay a stack of old pay stubs bound with a rubber band, a union meeting badge from years ago, and a photograph of the four of us at Mill Creek Park. Linda in a red sweater, Daniel holding a stick like a sword, Michael trying to skip a stone and laughing when it plopped instead. I ran a thumb over the edge of the photo and felt the ridge where the paper had bent. We had been a simple picture then. Work dinner school, the leaning tower of laundry, small victories measured in clean plates and a roof that held. The furnace clicked and came alive. Warmth crept from the floor vents with a faint smell of dust. I stood and walked to the living room and sat in my chair facing the window. The streetlights had come on pools of amber on the sidewalk. Somewhere down the block a dog barked, then stopped. I could still feel Daniel's words ringing like a tuning fork in my bones. Failure. That label did not fit the man who lifted machines back to life, who kept nights running when a line went dark, who held his wife's hand through appointments, who taught two boys to change a tire by the side of Route 224 in the rain. Linda would have asked me to breathe, so I did. In and out, counting without counting. I thought of Sarasota, of mornings when we rented a little condo near Siesta Key, and she said the water had a color you could drink with your eyes. We had planned more of that after retirement. The plans shrank when the calendar filled with appointments, but we kept a part of them alive in a folder she kept near the desk. I remembered the way she looked at me over the rim of a coffee mug and told me that the important thing was not the trip, it was the way we kept choosing to step forward. I saw then that Daniel had been moving away from us by inches long before today. He had stepped onto a track that felt clean and efficient, a track that made feelings into obstacles and people into problems to solve. When Linda got sick, he did not know what to do with a problem that would not bend. He tried to push us into a shape that fit his schedule and his fear. The coldness I felt today was not a sudden winter. It was the sum of many small chills. I stood and turned off the lamp in the corner. The room fell into a softer dark. I picked up Linda's photo from the entry table and set it on the mantel where the evening light could find it in the morning. The house exhaled. I walked down the hall and placed my palm on the bedroom door, then pushed it open. Her side of the bed was still made perfectly, the pillow dent smoothed with the care I had taught myself after she was gone. I sat on the edge of my side and untied my shoes slowly, the laces rough under my fingers. The truth arrived quietly. Daniel had not invented this version of himself today. He had been practicing it for years. Knowing that did not lessen the sting, but it made the shape of the hurt clearer. I lay back and stared at the ceiling where the streetlight traced a pale square. The furnace hummed again, steady as a heart. I closed my eyes and let the warmth reach my hands. Linda had asked me to be steady. I would try. My eyes found the screen and the name Daniel. I sat up and answered. "Dad." His voice came hard and flat. "You have been a failure from work to family to now. Do not drag us down with you. Sell the house and let me handle what you cannot." The words landed like a slap. I swung my feet to the floor and felt the cold through my socks. "Daniel," he barreled on, "you could not keep up at the end, and you know it. Mom did everything. You are alone now, and it shows. The bills, the maintenance, the taxes. You are not thinking clearly. Let it go before you make a mess we have to clean up." My jaw tightened. I wanted to remind him of nights when I held this house together with nothing but stubbornness and a plunger when I shoveled snow at 5 in the morning, so he would not miss the bus, when overtime meant the mortgage did not go late. The words bunched in my chest and would not move. I said, I am managing. I said it again, slower. I am managing. Susan's voice slid into the call, smooth and controlled. Robert, this is unnecessary. If you transfer authority, we can protect your assets. If you refuse, the court can find that you lack capacity to manage your finances. Then you will not have a choice. You will try to have me declared incompetent. There are pathways when an elder is at risk. Medical affidavits, a hearing temporary guardianship. Judges prefer order. We can make this orderly. Dad, this is not personal. It is practical. You cannot keep up. The house is too much. Your memory is not what it was. I saw you forget the garage code last month. You left the porch light on all day on Tuesday. This is not safe. I said I appreciate your concern. I am not surrendering my life because you have a list of light bulbs. Then Susan again, a notch firmer. If you cooperate, we can avoid filings that will create public record. Think about your reputation. Think about Emily. She does not need whispers at school about a grandfather who lost his mind. I said Emily knows me. She will not be guided by whispers. Daniel came back in clipped and quick. This is the last time I am asking nicely. Sign the power of attorney paperwork, and we will handle the sale. You can move to a condo near Boardman. 1 bedroom, no stairs. I will find a place with a view of a retention pond. You will not have to fix anything ever again. My voice came out calm. You have thought a lot about the view from a pond, son. I am still standing in the house your mother chose. I am not a project for you to flip. He ignored that. I am trying to keep you from embarrassing yourself and from burning value while you do it. The market is shifting. Taxes are going up. Insurance is brutal near the river. Every month you hold is money you are throwing away. Linda used to laugh when Daniel turned people into spreadsheets. She would say that he could monetize air if a buyer stood still long enough. Now he was pricing out my breath. I said I am not for sale. Then we will do what we have to do. We will petition. We will bring letters from your doctor. We will show lapses. We will show how you missed a payment last fall. I remembered that payment, a bill that had slid under a magazine on the hall table during the week of Linda's second round of chemo. I paid the late fee the day I found it. I said I missed 1 bill while your mother was ill. That is not a diagnosis. Bring whatever you think you have. Bring it into daylight. Susan returned measured. Robert, there is no need to make this adversarial. Sign now, and we avoid the spectacle. Spectacle. I saw a courtroom in my mind. A judge who did not know my name looking over a file while strangers weighed the slope of my handwriting and the dates on envelopes. I saw how they would paint the man who forgets a code and leaves lights on. They were not trying to help me. They were building a case to move me. I did not feel my grip loosen. The phone dropped anyway. I let it hang there. For a long breath, I stood in the bedroom doorway, listening to 2 people. I should have been able to trust, write a map to my removal. Then I bent and picked the phone up. I said, Daniel. He stopped. I said, I hear you. I will not be signing anything tonight. If you attempt what you are threatening, I will meet you in court fully awake and fully represented. If you choose to be my son, call me when you remember what that means. He started to speak, but I ended the call. The screen went black, and I saw my reflection. A man with sleep crushed into the corners of his eyes and a set to his mouth that I had last seen years ago on the night a bearing seized and the mill tried its best to tear itself apart. I slid the phone into the drawer of the nightstand and closed it with a careful push. The furnace cycled. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water and drank it slowly, feeling each swallow mark a line down my throat to my chest. The clock over the sink ticked toward midnight. I stood with my palm flat on the counter and looked at the calendar still pinned to the wall. Linda's handwriting watched me from every square. The cold crept through the doorframe and needled my wrist where the robe no longer covered it. I remembered Daniel as a boy with a fever the night I slept in a chair by his bed, and counted his breaths because the doctor said the croup would pass, but it sounded like wind through a narrow chimney. I remembered Susan at Thanksgiving the year she and Daniel got engaged, the way she had arranged the pie slices like a brochure. Pieces fit neatly when you cut them yourself. I went back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress. My hands knew what to do. They found Linda's pillow and pressed it smooth. They set the phone back on the nightstand and faced it toward the wall. They turned out the lamp. Medical notes, petitions, hearings. Not a family conversation, a strategy. The understanding clicked into place with a quiet finality. My son did not just want me to sell a house. He wanted to remove my authority and replace it with his. He wanted paperwork that would let him sign my name while telling me to rest. The heat inside me found a focus. It did not roar. It settled. It felt like the first turn of a wrench on a stuck bolt. The piece had not moved yet, but something in the metal understood that it would. I lay back and let my eyes adjust. The ceiling resolved into familiar planes and shadows. I breathed until the air in the room felt even. I thought of Linda saying that panic is only useful if you are drowning, and even then it will drown you faster. I held on to the thought the way a man holds a rail at the top of a stair in the dark. The night stretched quiet and long, and I stayed with it. When the clock in the hall reached 1, I closed my eyes and let the dark rest against my face. I did not know exactly what tomorrow would ask, but I knew one thing with a kind of steady certainty I had not felt in months. I would not let them write me out of my own life. Morning came gray and honest, and I made coffee standing at the sink with the mug warming my hands. A car door sounded out front. I set the mug down and went to the window. Emily was climbing the steps with her backpack over one shoulder, a University of Michigan beanie pulled low. I opened the door before she knocked. She smiled in that way Linda used to smile when something was hard but already decided. She came in with a sweep of cold air. She looked at the framed photo of her grandmother, then at me, and I could see she knew more than I wished she did. I asked if she had eaten. She said she was fine and asked for coffee. We moved to the kitchen. I poured her a mug and watched her wrap both hands around it. She said Mom called last night and said Dad was handling things and that I was not. She said something about court, and I hung up and drove here. I leaned against the counter. I told Emily that her father thinks I should sell and let him steer. I said I am not ready to hand over the wheel. She nodded. Grandpa, she said, I know about the house. I know about last night. I came for something else too. She unzipped her backpack and pulled out a small stack of envelopes with the credit union logo and my name in the corner. She laid them on the table. I looked from the envelopes to her. She said, I know you sent help. I knew it the first semester when the bursar portal showed a balance change before I could even make the call. You sent a check every term. You put my books on a card I did not know existed. You wrote notes on the memo line. Buy the heavy coat. Choose the better lab section even if it costs more. I did not say anything because I figured you did not want a fuss. But I knew. I sat down. Linda and I had decided together that if Daniel and Susan leaned away, we would lean in. I told Emily I did what a grandparent should do. She put her hand over mine and shook her head and said you did something that mattered when it counted. Then she said the words that loosened something in me. You are not a failure. I took a breath that did not scrape. She said she heard the rest of what they said. Mom used the phrase lack of capacity. She said guardianship. She said you forget things. She said the house is too much. Maybe she believes that. I do not. I asked if she had slept. She shook her head and said she kept seeing my porch light and thinking I might be standing under it the way I did when she was 10, and I showed her how to find the North Star. She said, I know who you are, and if they try to drag you somewhere you do not want to go, they will have to walk through me first. I wanted to tell her she was too young to shoulder this. The words formed and dissolved. She had the straight spine of someone who had already made a few hard decisions alone. We sat for a stretch. She told me about Ann Arbor, the snow that makes the quad crunch, a professor who speaks softly and asks hard questions, and that social work feels like building a small ladder for people told they belong in holes. I asked about her roommate. She smiled, and then said the thing that would stay with me longer than any detail of campus life. You are the only one who never left me alone with the hard parts. When Dad was busy and Mom was worried, and it was loud at home, you came and sat in the bleachers for every junior varsity game. You showed up with a thermos and a blanket and sat like I was playing in a stadium. You do not fail at people. I let those words take up space. I thanked her for saying them and told her a man can forget who he is when someone he loves dies and someone else he loves calls him by a name that is not his. She moved around the table and hugged me. It was solid and sure. The top of her head tucked under my chin, the way it had when she was little. She said, "You have always been here. You are the one person who never left." Then she wiped her eyes like it was nothing, and it was everything. We made eggs and burned the first batch and laughed. Emily ate toast and said she had an afternoon class but could skip if I needed her. I told her to go to class. I told her the world needs more people who know how to listen the way she does. For once, the word fine did not taste like chalk. She pulled out a notebook and pen. "Make a list with me," she said. "Things we need to do." I started to protest and then did not. We wrote simple lines. Find a lawyer who knew Linda. Gather documents. Check bills. Call the doctor to schedule a routine memory screening. Put a camera over the driveway because a good record matters when someone is building a case. I watched her write in neat block letters and felt something click back into place. Not the old life. Something new that could hold weight. When we finished, she underlined the last line. She grinned. In her face, I saw the way forward. It was not a highway. It was a local road with bumps and a shoulder wide enough to pull over if we needed to think. She packed her notebook and zipped her backpack and stood. At the door, she paused and looked at Linda's photo. "Tell her for me," she said. "Tell her I am taking care of you while you take care of you." I told her that Linda already knew. Emily smiled like that made sense and stepped into the cold. I watched her cross the yard and tug her beanie down. She waved without turning around. The gate clicked. The street took her toward the car a friend had loaned her. The house took the quiet she left and held it. I rinsed the mugs and set them to dry. My hands did not shake. The calendar on the wall no longer felt like a ledger of demands. It looked like a map. I folded the list and slipped it into my shirt pocket and tapped it twice. I looked at the mantel where Linda's picture watched the room with calm eyes. The faith Emily brought settled in like a steady heart rate after a hard run. I stood in the front hall and put on my coat. The day waited, and it did not feel like an enemy. I reached for the knob and felt the grain of the wood and the cold of the metal and an ease in my shoulders I had not felt since the diagnosis. Then I opened the door and stepped onto the porch, ready to begin the list one line at a time. Emily had gone back to Ann Arbor. Find a lawyer. Daniel texted that they were on their way. When I opened the door, he was already stepping inside, coat unbuttoned, the wind lifting his hair. Susan followed with a folder chin set. Michael came in last. We sat at the dining table. Susan placed the folder in the center and slid a single sheet toward me. Daniel said we need to be efficient. He said he had another appointment in an hour. He said this is a simple power of attorney so we can take the burden off your hands. I picked up the paper. It was dense with lines that pretended to be helpful and a paragraph that handed over almost everything that mattered. I asked what exactly they planned to do with this. Daniel said, execute a sale, manage accounts, deal with maintenance, keep me safe. Susan said this would allow us to make timely decisions and prevent loss. I folded the paper back toward her and asked if she had spoken to an attorney about this. Susan said she had consulted with a colleague who drafts these every day. Michael cleared his throat and said, maybe we could take things step by step. He said maybe there was a way for me to keep some control and still get help with the heavy lifting. Daniel said, this is not complicated. I asked Daniel if he thought I had lost my mind. He said, you are struggling. You forget things. You do not move as fast as real life requires. Susan said there is no accusation here. She said this is love expressed as responsibility. She said that if I refused, they would have to protect me another way. I asked what other way. Daniel said the court could appoint a guardian. Susan said the hearing could be quick if I cooperated with medical notes. Daniel added that it would be better for everyone if I signed now. He said, do not make me be the bad guy. He said, I am trying to save you from embarrassment. I said, I will not sign this today. My voice sounded steady. I said, I will not sign it next week either. If you want authority over my life, you will have to ask a judge for it. I folded the paper once and slid it back across the table. Daniel said, you are making a mistake. He said, you are making me the enemy. Susan added that the filing would be ready by Monday. She said we would serve notice and set a date. She said, it is better to keep this inside the family, but if you insist on public record, so be it. Michael said, we do not have to go to court. He said, there is no need to put Dad through that. Daniel snapped that the need was obvious. He said he had already talked to a notary and that we could have handled this with 10 minutes and a signature. I stood. I said you came into my house and tried to move me like furniture. I said you chose paperwork over conversation. I said, if you want a fight, we will have one in the proper place. Susan said, do not make it worse. She said the neighbors do not need a spectacle. I said the neighbors already know how to read faces. Then I pushed my chair in and walked into the living room. At the doorway I stopped and turned. Daniel had the pen in his hand, like he might try to press it into mine on his way out. I said no. I opened the front door. Across the street, Mr. Thompson stood on his porch in a heavy coat. Daniel said, we will be in touch. Susan added that we would regret this delay. I stepped aside so they could pass. Susan followed folder tucked under her arm like a shield. Michael lagged. He put a hand on my arm and spoke quietly. He said, I am sorry. He said, I will call you tonight. On the porch, Daniel turned back as if to deliver a last line. He did not find it. He went down the steps with a jerk of his jaw. Susan touched his elbow and steered him toward the car. Michael paused at the bottom step and looked up at me. He nodded once. I stayed in the doorway and watched them go. The car door slammed. The engine turned over. They pulled away with a crunch of salt on asphalt. I lifted my hand back and closed the door. The house settled around me with a sound like an exhale. I walked back to the dining room and picked up the paper they had left and slid it into the drawer with the placemats. My hands were steady. My chest, which had stayed tight all morning, loosened enough for a deeper breath. I stood at the window and looked out at the pale afternoon. A young couple pushed a stroller past. Life proceeded with its stubborn forward motion, indifferent to battles carried by people inside brick walls. I felt a clear line run through me from my heels to the crown of my head. Something had ended in that room. Something else had begun. On the sideboard sat the small wooden box where Linda kept stamps and return address labels. I opened it and took out a single sheet with her neat initials in the corner. I wrote a short note to myself. Call Karen White. Gather records. Make copies. I walked back to the doorway and stood there listening to the house measure the hour. The clock ticked on. The fight was out in the open now. It did not feel like doom. It felt like weather, and I had worked in worse. The day had drawn its line cleanly. I let the quiet stand and held it with a steadiness that felt like mine. Evening settled in pieces the way frost gathers on a windshield, thin at first and then everywhere. I turned on the lamp by Linda's desk, and the room took on the soft amber she always liked. The desk itself was small maple nicked along the front edge where she rested her rings when she wrote checks. I opened the top drawer and found the usual things a life accumulates. Pens that worked until they did not. Paper clips in a ceramic bowl from a church craft fair. The savings passbook we kept for show more than use once everything went online. Under the passbook lay a brass key with a strip of blue tape wrapped around its head and Linda's careful script on the tape. File cabinet. I crossed the hall to the storage room we always called her office, even when it held more memory than work. The file cabinet stood against the wall like a quiet, patient friend. I slid the key in and felt the lock give with a soft click. The top drawer rolled out with that metal sigh that carries both resistance and relief. Hanging folders in colors that had faded to honest shades held our years in order. Taxes, insurance, medical, household, Sarasota. I rested a hand on that last tab without pulling it yet, then moved first to a plain manila folder marked Estate. Inside lay a smaller gray envelope sealed only by habit. I lifted the flap and slid out a packet thicker than I expected. The first page carried the title that makes a throat tighten even when you know it is coming. Last Will and Testament of Linda Hayes. The notary stamp sat crisp in the corner. The date read June 12, 2015. I felt my mouth go dry as I turned the pages carefully, the way you handle something both strong and delicate. There were clean paragraphs in language that belonged to lawyers, and then the parts that belonged to a woman who had planned. I read the section that named me as personal representative. I read the section that defined her property. I read the bequests and stopped when the names did not appear where my eyes expected them. There was Robert Hayes, my name followed by language that left me the marital home and the accounts in joint tenancy. There was Emily Hayes, our granddaughter, named as beneficiary of a specific education fund and additional personal property to be enumerated in a separate list. There was a paragraph in small, precise words that said that any child or in-law who contested the will would receive $1 and no further interest. I read that paragraph 3 times. Daniel's name did not appear in the bequest section. Susan's name did not appear at all. The page did not tremble in my hands, but something in me shifted 1 degree toward balance. I set the packet down and went back to the drawer for the Sarasota folder. We had labeled it during a spring when the Gulf air had seemed to clear Linda's lungs and make her laugh younger. The folder held a deed to a small condo near Siesta Key, recorded with Sarasota County in August 2015. The sales price felt both modest and miraculous, given what it had bought us in sunsets and slow mornings. Tucked behind the deed was a sheet of paper in Linda's script. It listed the homeowners association contact, a locksmith she trusted, and the name of a neighbor who watered our balcony basil when we were late getting down. At the bottom, she had written a line in the shorthand we used at the kitchen table. Check AC filter quarterly. Fix before it breaks. Beneath the Sarasota folder was one labeled Joint. Inside, I found a statement from Great Lakes Credit Union for an account titled Robert Hayes, or Emily Hayes payable on death designation confirmed. The statement showed deposits that matched the calendar of our last years. Small, steady, the way Linda liked to build anything that mattered. Tuition checks out. Occasional bookstore charge. An annotation in Linda's neat pencil marked the account as education and emergency, and then she drew a small heart next to Emily's name with a line through it, as if to underline the idea rather than decorate it. At the back of the drawer lay a shallow archival box, the kind Linda bought when she wanted to make memory behave. I lifted the lid. Inside envelopes sat in a gentle stack. The top one held letters she had written to Emily for birthdays she might miss. The second carried recipes written in a hand that had measured flour and salt for decades without ever using a scale. At the bottom was a single folded note, addressed to me, not sealed, just folded once with care. I sat on the small upholstered chair under the window and opened it. Robert, it began in a steady hand. If you are reading this, it means the careful plans need to become actions. You will need these documents to protect the family that is truly ours. Make decisions from quiet, not fear. Do not let anyone convince you that love looks like control. I could almost hear her voice in the way the words were arranged. She had a way of being kind without rounding off the truth. I held the note and looked back at the will. June 12, 2015. I thought about where we were that summer. Linda had still hiked short trails then. She could walk from the condo to the beach and back before the sun turned bossy. That was also the summer Daniel closed his first big deal downtown and bragged about the commission check like it was a medal pinned to his chest by the mayor. He had pressed us to invest with him in a property he said could not miss. Linda had smiled at him and asked 3 questions about liquidity that he could not answer in a way that respected risk. She had told me that night that love and money get on best when they sleep on separate couches. 2 weeks later, she met with a lawyer without telling me. She was not hiding it. She was getting her thoughts in order before we discussed them. That was her way. I went back to the will and read the clause that explained the no contest provision again. It sat elegant and calm, built for weather. There was no meanness in it. Only a boundary that said we would not fund fights that damaged the people we loved. I pictured Daniel hearing those words in a conference room and felt the old ache rise and then settle. If he had stayed a son instead of a strategist, none of this would have felt like a fortification. I took the documents to the dining table because that was where serious things were examined in our house. The table had seen homework and taxes, and the morning Linda told me the doctor had found something, and then said the word we both refused to say out loud for a week because it seemed to take power that way. I spread the will, the deed, and the account statement. I arranged them like a mechanic laying out parts in the order they would go back into the engine. Then I brought the small safe from the hall closet, spun the dial, and opened it. Inside were passports, the original mortgage release, our marriage certificate, and the letters of condolence I could not yet bear to reread. I placed the will packet in a zip folder, slid the deed and the account statement behind it, and put the note from Linda on top where I could see her handwriting when I opened the safe again. The house grew quiet in the way a room does when it recognizes work is being done rather than merely thought about. I sat and ran through the order of operations in my head. Photocopy everything. Store originals in the bank box downtown. Put copies in the safe here. Call Great Lakes to confirm titles and beneficiaries. Check the condo insurance and tax status. Notify the homeowners association of Linda's passing and my intent to maintain the unit. Then I added a name to the list. Karen White. It had been years, but Karen was the person Linda trusted when the subject turned to legal shape rather than emotional weather. I took my phone from the counter and set a reminder for the morning to call Karen's office. Then I hesitated and called Emily instead. She answered on the second ring, and the noise of a campus hallway drifted into my kitchen. I told her I had found some documents and that they were clear in ways that would matter. She grew quiet in a way that meant she was listening with her whole attention. I told her that there was an account with her name on it, that her grandmother had put it together over years, that it was meant for her school and her steps into whatever came next. She let out a breath that sounded like relief and responsibility braided together. She said, "I will use it exactly the way Grandma wanted." Then she said 3 words that felt like a hand steadying mine over the gear shift. "I got you." After the call, I went to the front window. The streetlight had come on and made a soft pool on the sidewalk. Somewhere a radio played the kind of oldies station Linda favored when she cooked. I closed the curtains and returned to the table. One last document at the bottom of the estate folder caught my eye. It was a separate personal property memorandum handwritten with items listed by room. Linda had assigned her grandmother's quilt to Emily, and her book of recipes and the ceramic bowl to me, with a small note that said, "For the paper clips and whatever else life requires." On the last line she had written a sentence that I knew she would have spoken, with a half smile. "If Robert is reading this without me, remind him that caution is a tool, not a home." That was when the twist of it all settled fully into place. This was not an accident of timing or an oversight. In 2015, when Daniel was climbing and Susan was leaning, Linda had drawn a clear map. Daniel and Susan would not inherit. Emily would be supported. I would hold responsibility without apology. There was no malice in the paper, only a choice about where to put trust. I felt both protected and called to live up to the trust that had been placed in me. I packed the folders in order and returned them to the file cabinet, then locked it and slipped the key back onto the blue tape hook inside the desk drawer. I took the zip folder of originals to the safe and closed it with a firm turn. The house held the kind of quiet that comes after a storm passes far enough away for you to count between lightning and thunder. I washed a glass, set it upside down on the towel, and turned off the kitchen light. In the hallway, I paused by the frame where Linda kept a collage of our years. Florida sand in tiny vials with dates. Ticket stubs from a high school play Emily starred in, where she had 2 lines and stole the scene anyway. A photo of Daniel at 8 with a missing front tooth and the certainty that the world would give him a ladder on demand. I touched the glass lightly and felt the smoothness cool my fingertips. Back in the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and unlaced my shoes. The night had shifted around me. It no longer felt like a room where I was waiting to be acted upon. It felt like a place where I could choose the next fixed point. The list for morning sat on the nightstand under Linda's note. I read the line in my head again, the one she had written with that steadiness I loved. I would need these documents to protect the family that was truly ours. I reached over and turned out the lamp and lay back. The dark felt clean. The path, while narrow, felt walkable. I closed my eyes and let sleep come, knowing that tomorrow I would carry these papers into daylight and begin. I dressed, tucked the zip folder into my coat, and drove toward Boardman along Market Street. I parked beside a low brick building that used to be a bank and now held a cluster of small offices behind frosted glass doors. I checked the time and went in. A younger woman at the desk looked up from a ledger and recognized my name before I finished saying it. She buzzed the back door and told me to follow the hall to the last office on the left. Karen stood when I appeared. She held out both hands and I met her halfway. "You found me just in time," she said, and there was warmth in it, but also the kind of firmness that does not leave you room to collapse. "Sit and tell me everything you brought." I set the zip folder on her desk and took the chair that faced the window. I gave her the will first. She read fast and then slowed at the places that mattered. June 12, 2015. Her eyes moved as if she were mapping a familiar road. She said, "This is clean." She said Linda was a practical woman, and it shows. She looked up at me. "Robert, this will is valid. Your son has no claim through it. Your daughter-in-law has none at all." I felt it in my shoulders. She asked for the deed. I gave her the Sarasota folder. She said it passes to you outside probate clean as a whistle. She nodded at the title. "Robert Hayes or Emily Hayes, payable on death confirmed." She said that account will move as intended, and unless someone lies to a court, no one can touch it. I told her what had happened at the house, the folder on my table, the pen placed near my hand like bait. I told her about the threatened petition for guardianship. Karen listened without interrupting. When I finished, she rested her elbows on the desk and steepled her fingers in a way that made me think of old photographs of judges. She said the will is settled, but guardianship is a different river. Then she gave me the lay of that river like a map. In Ohio, she said they cannot get guardianship because they want it. They have to show that you are incompetent to manage your person or your estate. That is not a word I enjoy using, but it is the word the court uses. They need medical evidence. They need affidavits. They need to show a pattern in your daily life that proves you cannot meet your basic needs or safeguard your property. A missed bill during chemo season is not a pattern. A porch light left on is not a pattern. If they file, we will meet them with documents and witnesses and the ordinary proof of a life being lived with care. I asked what proof lives look like in court. She said bank statements paid on time, current taxes, insurance in force, a letter from your primary care physician stating you are oriented, managing your medications, and free of conditions that impair judgment. She suggested a cognitive screening, not because she doubted me, but because paper makes strangers listen. She said, bring in a MOCA or equivalent dated and signed, and keep the score in the file. I told her about the list in my pocket, the one Emily and I made at the kitchen table. She said, update your own power of attorney to someone you trust, not to hand over control today, but to name your choice if you ever want help later. A durable power that springs on a doctor's letter can stop a court from assigning a stranger. It is not surrender. It is a lock with a key you choose. I said Emily is 19. Karen nodded. She said that makes her an adult for these purposes. She said you can give her limited authority for specific accounts like the education fund, but keep your general authority to yourself. If you worry that places might demand a second name on file to prove continuity, add Michael as a secondary contact with no decision power. She said, do not give Daniel or Susan anything to wave in a clerk's face. Documents, she said. Originals to the bank box, copies in your safe, a third set to me. She asked about my doctor. I gave her the name and the clinic. She said, call today, schedule a regular checkup, and include a capacity evaluation. Ask them to write the conclusion plainly. She said medical people sometimes soften the words, and courts do not read soft. She said, while you are at it, sign a HIPAA release naming Emily and Michael so they can obtain records if you ask them to, and not because someone is trying to wedge a door. You should know, she said, that if they file, and a judge is having a hard day, temporary guardianship can be granted for a short window even without perfect proof. That is rare, and it is often reversed when a fuller hearing is held, but it can happen. If it does, do not panic. Call me. We move quickly. We file objections. We show the binder. We ask for an independent evaluation. I felt a twitch of anger and swallowed it so it would not spill into the room. She said, "You are not on a witness stand yet. Breathe." Then she added something that belonged less to law and more to life. Grief makes families clumsy. Money makes them mean. Do not be either. Be exact. Be the version of you Linda trusted when she wrote this will. She told her assistant to make copies of everything and to scan them to a labeled drive. A neuropsychologist in Canfield for screening and a private investigator she trusts for light documentation if anyone starts playing games with your mail or your accounts. Linda loved you in a way that made planning possible, she said. I believe she expected this exact moment and set the pins so they would not fall. You finished the frame, she started. I thanked her. She said, call me if they serve you. Call me if you hear from a clerk. Call me even if you only hear rumors. I sat in the car and dialed my doctor. The receptionist offered me an appointment 2 weeks out. I asked about cancellations, and she slipped me into a slot tomorrow at 9. Then I called Emily. I told her the will stood and that Karen was on our side. She said, say the word and I will drive down. I told her to go to class and that I would text her after the appointment. I filled a page with a log of calls and dates starting with Daniel's visit and the late-night threat. No adjectives, only facts. It felt like laying bricks on level ground. I raised a hand. He raised one back. If I needed him to say what he saw, he would. Not drama, just a neighbor telling the truth. Then I stood there with both hands on the wood and took a long breath in through my nose and let it out slow. The decision set itself inside me with a clean click. They could try paper and petition and posture. I would meet them with steadiness and law and the life Linda and I built. I would not back away from my own name. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, a mix that always reminds me that rules live here. Karen met me at the door with her steady walk and that small nod that means stay with me. We rode the elevator with a bailiff who looked like he had seen most human storms and survived all of them. On the 3rd floor, a clerk pointed us to a narrow courtroom with pew benches and a seal on the wall. Daniel and Susan sat at the petitioner table with a tidy stack of papers and a briefcase that looked new. Michael was in the 2nd row behind them, hands folded, eyes on the floor. I took my seat beside Karen and set the binder in front of me, tabs lined up like a small parade. The bailiff called the case and we stood. Guardianship of Robert Hayes, petition by Daniel Hayes. Judge Miller took the bench. He said we were here on a petition for guardianship of the person and the estate, and that he would hear from the petitioner first, then from the respondent, then from any witnesses. Daniel rose and cleared his throat. He said that his father was no longer able to manage his affairs, and that the family was concerned for his safety and his assets. He said there had been missed payments and confusion about times, and that the house was too much and a condo would be safer. He said guardianship would provide order and protect a man who did not see the decline everyone else saw. Susan stepped forward with a small folder of her own. She said she had observed me forgetting the garage code and leaving the porch light on for a day and missing a tax bill last fall. She said I repeated questions about dates, asked the time more than once in an evening, and seemed overwhelmed by routine tasks. Judge Miller asked Daniel if he had medical documentation. Daniel said he had observations and family experience, and that a formal evaluation had been suggested but not yet done. The judge asked for dates. He said the house requires maintenance and that I get tired and forget. He said he had offered to take responsibility and that I had refused. Karen stood and asked the judge if she could begin with a few clarifying questions to the petitioner. She asked Daniel if he had seen a doctor report stating I lacked capacity. She asked if any elder services agency had conducted a home assessment. She asked if he had keys to my accounts or signature authority. She asked if he had a plan to sell the house. He said that a quick sale would preserve value. Karen let the word quick sit in the air, where the judge could hear it breathe. The judge turned to me. I said that I live in the same house I have lived in since the boys were small, that my bills are paid, that my taxes are current, and that my doctor sees me regularly. I said that the late bill they referenced happened during my wife's chemotherapy, and that I paid the fee the day I found it. A small smile flickered at one corner of the judge's mouth, and then vanished. I said bank statements all current. I said utility receipts all current. I said homeowner's insurance paid in full. I turned to the medical tab and said, "Here is a letter from my primary care physician, dated last week, stating that I am oriented and competent to manage medications and finances." I added the cognitive screening score and said the number out loud. "Here is my late wife's will executed in 2015, validly witnessed and notarized, which designates me as personal representative and sets out specific bequests, including a fund for my granddaughter. Here is the deed to the Sarasota condo titled in joint tenancy, which passed to me by operation of law when my wife died. Here is the credit union statement for an account titled Robert Hayes or Emily Hayes, with a payable on death designation confirmed. These assets are organized and not at risk." Karen summarized for the judge, "No probate dispute before this court. No joint account confusion. No vacancy in management. No crisis." The judge said the will speaks for itself and that this hearing is about capacity, not inheritance. Karen asked leave to call a witness. Mr. Thompson testified simply. He said he sees me drive and shovel and carry groceries, that I come and go on a regular schedule, that I keep up with the trash pickup calendar, that I speak clearly and remember names and dates. He said nothing in my conduct suggests confusion beyond the kind every human carries into winter. Karen offered affidavits from Pastor Reynolds and the pharmacist at the clinic. Pastor sees me at services and at a weekly men's breakfast. Pharmacist confirms I manage a small set of medications without missed refills or dangerous interactions. Daniel said none of that changes, that age does what age does, and that waiting for a collapse is not kindness. He said if the court would grant temporary guardianship, he could stabilize the situation and move me before winter ice made the steps unsafe. He used the word stabilize as if a person were a market. The judge asked Daniel whether he had spoken to me about a less restrictive alternative, like a durable power that springs only upon medical certification. Daniel said that his schedule did not permit a drawn-out conversation. Karen said the less restrictive alternative already exists. She handed up a document dated yesterday, naming me as my own agent, until such time as 2 physicians declare otherwise, at which point Emily would assist with specific tasks as needed. She said courts in Ohio favor the least restrictive means when safety is not at immediate risk. The judge asked me to describe how I pay my bills. I told him I keep a ledger by hand and reconcile monthly with online statements, that I set calendar reminders for due dates, that I have a weekly routine for maintenance tasks. He asked where my important papers are stored. I said originals in a bank box, copies in a safe at home, a third set with counsel. He asked me to tell him the name of the street where the courthouse sits, and I did that as well. He looked at me for a long second that felt respectful rather than probing. Karen said only this, that grief can be mistaken for confusion, and that in this case grief had produced organization. She said she believed that was what Linda had intended when she wrote her will. He said he did not see clear and convincing evidence that a guardianship was necessary or appropriate. He said the petition relied on isolated incidents without medical support and ignored a record of current bills, insurance taxes, and documented medical capacity. He said that the court would not be used to impose control where planning and independence were present. He said the petition was denied. Karen touched the edge of the binder with one finger, as if to thank it for showing up. Daniel stared at the papers on the bench as if he could change the result by rearranging the letters in his head. Michael lifted his eyes and met mine. He gave the smallest nod a man can give in public and still have it counted as a sign. The judge advised the parties that further petitions without new evidence would be viewed with disfavor. He suggested that the family consider counseling if peace was valued. We rose as he left the bench. The bailiff called the next case and the room shifted. Karen gathered our copies and placed them in the folder. She said, "Well done," not as praise but as a shared conclusion. We stepped into the hallway where voices bounced differently and made space for the next group to pass. Daniel and Susan came out a minute later. He looked at me as if to say something, and then looked past me instead. Susan kept her gaze fixed on a point just over my shoulder. Michael stopped beside me. He shook my hand as if to anchor both of us in something steadier than the morning had been. Outside, the air bit clean against my face. The sky had thinned to a pale winter blue, and the salt on the sidewalks made a soft crunch underfoot. Karen paused at the curb and told me to call her if anything touched my mailbox that did not belong. I told her I would. Back at the car, I rested my hand on the binder and felt the solid weight of paper and plan. The courthouse doors opened behind me and let out a slice of noise that faded fast in the cold. I closed my eyes for a moment, and let my body register what my mind already knew. I had walked into a room where someone tried to rename me, and I had kept my name. I started the engine and let the heater wake up, then pulled into the slow flow of traffic, not victorious but steady, which is better. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, a mix that always reminds me that rules live here. On the third floor, a clerk pointed us to a narrow courtroom with pew benches and a seal on the wall. I took my seat beside Karen. The bailiff called the case and we stood. Guardianship of Robert Hayes, petition by Daniel Hayes. He said we were here on a petition for guardianship of the person and the estate, and that he would hear from the petitioner first, then from the respondent, then from any witnesses. Daniel rose and cleared his throat. He said that his father was no longer able to manage his affairs, and that the family was concerned for his safety and his assets. He said there had been missed payments and confusion about times. He said guardianship would provide order and protect a man who did not see the decline everyone else saw. Susan stepped forward with a small folder of her own. She said she was worried and that she wanted to help. She said she had observed me forgetting the garage code and leaving the porch light on for a day and missing a tax bill last fall. She said I repeated questions about dates, asked the time more than once in an evening, and seemed overwhelmed by routine tasks. Judge Miller asked Daniel if he had medical documentation. Daniel said he had observations and family experience and that a formal evaluation had been suggested, but not yet done. The judge asked for dates. Daniel mentioned a Tuesday in November for the porch light, and a payment due in October that was paid later. He said he had offered to take responsibility and that I had refused. Karen stood and asked the judge if she could begin with a few clarifying questions to the petitioner. She asked Daniel if he had seen a doctor report stating I lacked capacity. He said no. She asked if any elder services agency had conducted a home assessment. He said no. She asked if he had keys to my accounts or signature authority. He said no. She asked if he had a plan to sell the house. He said yes, that a quick sale would preserve value. The judge turned to me. He asked if I wished to speak. I said that I live in the same house I have lived in since the boys were small, that my bills are paid, that my taxes are current, and that my doctor sees me regularly. I said that the late bill they referenced happened during my wife's chemotherapy, and that I paid the fee the day I found it. I said I sometimes leave a light on because I grew up in a mill town where a light left on in a winter window means someone is home. Karen handed me the binder and I opened it to the first tab. I said bank statements all current. I said utility receipts all current. I said homeowner's insurance paid in full. I slid copies to the clerk who walked them to the bench. I turned to the medical tab and said, "Here is a letter from my primary care physician dated last week, stating that I am oriented and competent to manage medications and finances." Karen gave the judge the letter and the screen summary. I said, "Here is my late wife's will executed in 2015, validly witnessed and notarized, which designates me as personal representative and sets out specific bequests, including a fund for my granddaughter." I said, "Here is the deed to the Sarasota condo, titled in joint tenancy, which passed to me by operation of law when my wife died." I said, "Here is the credit union statement for an account titled Robert Hayes or Emily Hayes, with a payable on death designation confirmed." I said these assets are organized and not at risk. Karen offered affidavits from Pastor Reynolds and the pharmacist at the clinic. Daniel asked to speak again. Permission given. He said none of that changes that age does what age does, and that waiting for a collapse is not kindness. The judge leaned back and considered him. He asked Daniel whether he had spoken to me about a less restrictive alternative like a durable power that springs only upon medical certification. Daniel said that was complicated and that his schedule did not permit a drawn-out conversation. Karen rose and said the less restrictive alternative already exists. She handed up a document dated yesterday naming me as my own agent until such time as two physicians declare otherwise, at which point Emily would assist with specific tasks as needed. The judge turned his attention to me. He asked me to describe how I pay my bills. I told him I keep a ledger by hand and reconcile monthly with online statements, that I set calendar reminders for due dates, that I have a weekly routine for maintenance tasks. He asked where my important papers are stored. I said originals in a bank box, copies in a safe at home, a third set with counsel. He asked me to tell him what day it was and the time. I did. He turned to Daniel and Susan. He said he understood the desire to help an older family member. He said he did not see clear and convincing evidence that a guardianship was necessary or appropriate. He said the petition relied on isolated incidents without medical support and ignored a record of current bills, insurance taxes, and documented medical capacity. He said that the court would not be used to impose control where planning and independence were present. He said the petition was denied. The judge added administrative orders. We rose as he left the bench. Karen gathered our copies and placed them in the folder. Daniel and Susan came out a minute later. Susan kept her gaze fixed ahead. Michael stopped beside me and shook my hand. Outside, the air bit clean against my face. Karen paused at the curb and told me to call her if anything touched my mailbox that did not belong, or if a bank clerk suddenly forgot how titles work. I told her I would. Back at the car, I rested my hand on the binder and felt the solid weight of paper and plan. I had walked into a room where someone tried to rename me, and I had kept my name. I started the engine and let the heater wake up, then pulled into the slow flow of traffic. Snow flurried across the windshield as Main Street opened ahead of me, and the traffic gave way to neighborhood speed. I turned onto Sycamore, and the maples reached in from both sides like an honor guard. The house came into view with its porch light pale in the winter afternoon. Michael sat behind the wheel with the engine off. He climbed out before I cut my ignition and met me halfway up the walk. He said he was sorry. He said he had let Daniel run the loud part of the family for too long and had convinced himself that silence was the safer job. He said the court had made him see something he had not wanted to admit. We went inside without rush. Michael took off his cap and turned it in his hands, then put it on the hook. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured coffee and he wrapped both hands around his mug. He said he had been afraid of Daniel since they were boys. He said that after Mom got sick, he started agreeing with whatever sounded decisive. He said he had stood there today while the thing he cared about most was getting renamed in front of him. He looked at the table when he said he had failed me more than once. I told him I had failed sons in my time too. I said the day he fell off the bike on Ramsey Street and chipped a tooth I had told him to get back on before checking if the bleeding had stopped. We talked about the year ice took the trees, and I taught him how to cut a fallen limb without binding the blade. Michael said he had told Emily the truth the night before, that he had stood too far back and let ambition decide the family weather. He said Emily had told him that leadership without kindness is just noise. He said he wanted to do better, and that he wanted to do it now, not after some holiday or some sale quarter or some comfortable later that never arrives. The front steps sounded with a quick pattern I knew. Emily came in with the cold riding her shoulders and put her backpack by the coat tree. She hugged Michael first and then me. She said she wanted me to hear this clearly. She said she would be with me at every appointment and every meeting and every errand that might turn into an ambush. She said if her parents drew a hard line, she would not cross it unless it led to a better house, and that for now, the house she wanted to stand in was mine. Michael took a breath that looked like a man stepping off a ferry onto steady land. He said he would call Daniel and tell him that the courtroom was a line he would not cross again. He said he would not vote by silence in family councils anymore. I slid the pad across. Replaced the furnace filter call insurance about the roof inspection scan copies of the will to the bank box file. He said he would start with the filter today. We moved to the basement with a flashlight and the familiar smell of laundry soap and concrete. Michael found the filter size without needing to ask, and he swapped the old for the new. I watched him write the date on the cardboard edge and felt something like a knot ease one notch. At the table again, I pulled a shoebox of photos from the sideboard. Emily lifted the top picture and laughed. There was Michael in a Halloween cape with a wooden sword, and Daniel in a football jersey too big for his shoulders, and Linda behind them, half turned toward me like she was about to say something smart enough to keep me humble. Emily took a photo of Linda at the beach and held it near the window. She said her grandmother had a way of making every plan sound like a promise, and every promise sound like a plan. The afternoon settled around us like a good coat. Michael set his cup in the sink and said he would be back in the morning to climb the ladder and check the gutters while the melt held. Emily gathered her notebook and said she would text me when she got to class, and that she would swing by the pharmacy for the refill they always misplace when snow is in the forecast. We stood by the door like a small team, choosing roles without ceremony. Michael put a hand on my shoulder, not heavy, just steady. He said he was proud of me. The words landed and stayed. Emily squeezed my arm and said we were not done building. They stepped onto the porch, and the cold took their breath for a second, and then gave it back. I watched them go down the walk together, their steps matching their heads angled toward each other, the way family looks when it remembers how to move as one. I stood in the quiet and listened to the house settle. The furnace kicked on with a sound that always reminds me of ships and distance. But today it sounded like home. I picked up the list and crossed off the filter. Outside, a thin sun pushed through and brightened the maple bark to a soft silver. For the first time since the church service, I felt the scale inside me tilt toward something I could carry. The break that had run across our family like a hairline crack was no longer a threat to the whole structure. It was a seam that could be stitched if hands were patient and hearts stayed. Word of the hearing drifted through town, the way winter light slides across a floor, slow at first, and then everywhere at once. Karen said the clerk posted the order before noon, and by evening the side column on the local site carried a short line about a petition denied for lack of proof. Someone clipped it and passed it through social feeds with comments that did not need my name to be understood. Daniel tried to steady the story by saying he had only been concerned that families have hard seasons, that he had meant well. Clients heard families have hard seasons, and what they understood was risk. The first to go was a tidy couple who had been under contract for a downtown second-floor condo with a view of the courthouse clock. Emily showed me the page where their agent wrote that they had decided to delay while the market settled. The words said market, and the silence said trust. 2 more listings followed within a day, both sellers asking to be reassigned inside the company so that transactions would not be clouded by what they called unnecessary drama. Michael told me that the phones at Daniel's office kept ringing, but the calls were not new business. They were warnings. A bigger shock landed the next week. Daniel had been courting a developer out of Columbus for a mixed-use conversion of an old brick warehouse near the river. Renderings had floated around for months, showing string lights and a clean courtyard and small shops with names made to look hand-painted. Financing was tied to pre-leasing and to the reputation of the broker who had assembled the parcels and promised to keep neighbors calm. When the lender requested a statement about governance and risk, someone connected dots that did not favor second chances. By Friday, the developer issued a hold notice, and the bank pulled the line that paid for feasibility signs and cushions of time. I heard about it from a man at the hardware store who had been hired to replace glass and now had no purchase order. Bills disliked fences. They went wherever space opened. The office lease on the corner did not care about reputation and wanted rent in a week. The staging furniture that filled empty houses with pleasant dreams was paid for with a line of credit that ticked interest at the end of every day. The ad buys for spring were already placed. Susan had believed she was building momentum. Then the phone began to deliver the other kind of momentum, the kind that pushes a person into plans they did not request. I did not smile when I heard it. There is no joy in watching a bridge you once helped build sag. Karen told me to keep my files neat since people in trouble sometimes look for new angles. She said she did not expect another petition soon, but that paper likes paper. I thanked her and said I needed a change of air for a few days. Emily had been trying to talk me south since the cold set in. She said the condo needed eyes on it anyway, and that her winter schedule would let her take notes and photos for a checklist. Michael drove us to the airport before dawn and carried our bags to the door. He said he would keep an eye on the house and make sure the snowblower started, even if the temperature dared him not to. The plane climbed through cloud, and then into that blue that always surprises me, the one that makes a person think of the times he came through storms and found sky again. Emily fell asleep with her head against the window and woke to the captain saying Sarasota, with a voice that sounded like vacation even in January. The air was soft on the jet bridge, and the palm fronds outside the ride-share lane looked drawn by a hand that liked curves. We crossed the bridge toward Siesta, and the water flashed on both sides like hammered metal, bright, then calm. The building stood pale against the sky, neat and plain in the way good buildings are. The manager at the desk remembered Linda and smiled at Emily with the warmth saved for grandchildren who send thank-you notes without being told. The key Linda marked with a small blue dot still worked. The first breath inside held salt and the gentlest sense of cedar from a box on the dresser that held postcards we had never mailed. Emily pushed the slider, and the sound of the Gulf came in like a steady hand on a shoulder. She stepped onto the lanai and leaned out, eyes wide, in a way that made her look younger for a heartbeat, and then older for the next. We walked the rooms quietly, not reverent exactly, but mindful. The towels were folded as Linda always folded them, even in a place meant for sand. On the counter sat a bowl filled with shells we had picked one afternoon, when the tide drew back farther than usual and left a line of small white gifts. A sun hat hung from the back of a chair, where Linda had left it the last time she sat to read the paper and call me to come fix a stubborn hinge. Emily laughed when she found a single postcard addressed to herself, in Linda's careful hand, never sent, because we had taken it home and decided to deliver it in person. She set it on the table like a small lantern. We walked the beach before sunset, bare feet in cool sand, letting the swash grab our ankles and then release them. A group nearby threw a frisbee in slow arcs that matched the pelicans further out. Emily told me about a paper she was writing on public trust, and how sometimes trust is just the sum of 1,000 small acts. I told her the mill taught me that too without using words for it. We did not talk about Daniel or Susan there. The horizon already carried everything anyone could say. Back at the condo, I sat in Linda's wicker chair on the lanai, while Emily typed notes about light fixtures and paint touch-ups and a call to the association about the elevator that paused between floors. The sky moved through late colors and the water stayed at its work. I let the sound settle me as if the day had decided to lay a steady hand over the nerve that had twitched since the funeral. Somewhere behind the sound, I heard Linda as she was, when the world was intact, not in the hospital voice, not in the final quiet, but in the good kitchen with the radio on low and flour on her hands. She said that I was not a failure. She had said it so many times in so many ways that the words had no sharp edges left. They fit the way a tool fits a task when a person has picked the right one. News does not take vacations. Michael texted to say the paper had run a longer piece about elder petitions and how courts prefer the least restrictive option. A second text said Daniel's company had lost a listing on Maple Grove. Then a builder withdrew from a new tract, then an insurance carrier asked for a personal guarantee on a marketing loan. He wrote that Daniel sounded tired when they spoke, and that Susan had stopped correcting everyone's grammar. I read the messages and put the phone face down. On the water, a single boat lifted and settled. Emily closed her laptop and pulled her feet up under her. She said this place feels like someone built it around a breath. I said Linda had a way of doing that even in rooms she did not own. We sat without filling the silence. The air cooled and the lantern over the table clicked on with a soft sound like a polite cough. I thought of the courthouse and of Mr. Thompson at the Market of Michael, at my table of Emily's hand on my arm. I thought of Daniel facing a road that finally told him he could not sprint his way through the slow work of trust. Night settled. The tide shifted, and the sound turned lower, like a choir dropping to a note you can feel in your chest. I was not triumphant. I was not waiting to tally anyone's losses. I was a man in a good chair, listening to a steady sea in a place his wife had loved. Consequences had found their way without my help. That was enough. I let my head rest back and breathed with the water. Tomorrow we would make a list and start on small repairs. Tonight the only work was to let the room be the room it had always promised to be. Morning came soft and blue, and the gulf kept its steady promise. I made coffee and opened the slider just enough to let the air change the room. Emily padded out from the second bedroom with a notebook balanced on her palm and a pencil behind her ear. She said the association office opened at 9 and she wanted to ask about the elevator inspection. I said I would check the balcony railing and the light over the sink. We moved without hurry, as if the day had been put together to let us catch up to it. We walked to a small market on the corner for eggs and bread and the kind of oranges that stain your fingers. The cashier smiled at Emily and told her to save the shells for plants. On the way back, we passed a man hosing sand off a kayak. He lifted a hand and asked how the water felt. Emily said the water told the truth better than people do. He laughed and said that sounded like a class he should take. Back upstairs, she taped a short list to the fridge and wrote the date in neat numbers that looked like Linda's when she made holiday menus. My phone buzzed with a message from Michael. He said the storm in Ohio missed town by a mile, and he had cleared my walk anyway. He said Mr. Thompson had left a bag of rock salt on the porch and a note that read, "For when luck forgets." Michael added that the hardware store guy asked after us and that people were still talking not about court, but about a line finally being drawn in a way that made sense. I told him we had sky for days down here and that he could hear the gulf through the phone if he held his breath. He said he could hear it even without that. We spent the late morning on simple tasks. Emily wiped the fan blades while I checked the sliders for smooth travel. I tightened the loose hinge Linda had asked me to see years ago and felt a small satisfaction at finishing a job I owed her. Emily found a drawer full of old manuals and clipped them into a folder. She turned to me and asked if a person can inherit steadiness. I said you learn it by watching the way you learn to hold a level and read its bubble. She said then I learned from you and from her. We ate sandwiches at the table with the door open and the curtain moving like it had a slow breath of its own. I told Emily a story she had heard but wanted again. Linda, in a yellow dress on the first day we saw this place, walking to the rail and claiming the view not with words, but with a kind of shining quiet. Emily said that was how her grandmother did most things. She said presence is louder than opinion. I nodded and let the room keep that thought for us. In the afternoon, we walked the beach again. We picked a straight stretch and set a pace that kept the heart awake. A boy chased gulls, and a woman in a wide hat read a paperback with her toes buried in the sand. We passed a couple who looked our age from a distance and younger when we got close. They were laughing at nothing in particular. Emily pointed to a set of footprints where one pair dragged a little. She said that person had carried something heavy and still kept going. I said, that is all any life asks. On the way back, we stopped at a small chapel that sits under palms and seems to hum even before the choir shows up. A volunteer straightened hymnals and told us the glass windows had been shipped from a church up north that had closed. I thought of our church in Ohio and of the day I stood by Linda's portrait. I thought of the word Daniel used without knowing its size. Failure. I held it up to the light like a piece of glass and saw what it was and what it was not. It was a label thrown by a man who wanted custody not of care, but of control. It was also a test I did not have to take. I had stayed. I had kept the house and the records and the stories. I had raised boys and built pieces of this town and fixed what broke when I could. I had loved Linda to the edge of her breath, and then passed it in the ways love asks afterward. That is not failure. That is the long work of an ordinary man. Back at the condo, Emily curled on the sofa with a book, and the sea gave us its silver conversation. I pulled a chair to the rail and watched a pelican work the same stretch of water with patient sweeps. Michael called and said a small thing had happened that felt large. A client who had pulled a listing from Daniel asked to move it to another agent, and had added a note thanking me for the way I had carried myself at the mill all those years. Michael said people remember more than you think. He said the word respect and left it there. I told him I felt it from here. Near sunset, the sky turned the color of a ripe peach and then slid toward a deeper tone that made every outline kind. Emily asked if I ever wished I had done something grand. I said I used to think that way when I was young enough to confuse volume with value. Then we raised a family and paid bills and made birthdays count and sat in emergency rooms and laughed our way out of arguments that did not matter, and I learned that quiet endurance is a bigger engine than applause. She said that sounds like a speech. I said it is just the truth that fits me. We ate pasta with garlic and watched the dark gather and felt fine about it. I told Emily we would fly back in 2 days, and I would take a pie to Mr. Thompson, and a handshake to the pastor, and a thank you to Karen. I told her I would speak plain with Daniel when he was ready, and set a boundary he could see without squinting. She said she would sit in on that talk if I wanted, and I said yes. She said Michael had asked her to help him put together a plan for his work that did not depend on the loudest voice in the room. The corners of her mouth lifted like a promise. Night came full, and the lantern made a small circle of gold on the table. I thought of Linda and felt both the missing and the gift. I do not have her hand in mine. I have the hand she helped me keep steady. I have Emily with her clear eyes and her stubborn hope. I have Michael with his new spine and his old kindness. I have a neighbor who sees me a pastor, who prays with his sleeves rolled, a lawyer who writes like a carpenter, fits joints. I have a town that knows the sound of work boots on a January morning, and a beach that tells me to breathe. I hear the word again, the one that was thrown at me in a church parking lot. I answer it now so it can be put down. I am a father. I am a grandfather. I show up. I learn. I do not leave the table when the conversation turns hard. I pay what I owe and keep faith where I can. I have not given up. That is not failure. That is the opposite of failure. If this story found you at a moment when someone called you less than you are, then tell me. Share the time you were discounted and kept going. Add your voice so that people who need a hand can hear a crowd instead of an echo. If this moved you, like and share and subscribe, not for me alone, but so these stories of justice and family and the strength we carry can travel farther than any of us can walk. I will keep telling them. You keep showing up. We will meet in the space where presence does the quiet work the world always needs.